throughout this entire talk, I've been a mixture of, oh my god, I'm so glad that I've never committed keys to anything, to, oh god, I'm really glad I've never committed keys to everything.
Imagine a tool that could take a private key like this one and immediately tell you whether or not it was used to encrypt something sensitive. We built that tool. We're open sourcing it and giving it away for free. It's called Driftwood. We used it to show that you can compromise hundreds of websites from keys that we found. We used it to show that you can poison millions of devices. But to understand how all this is possible and why it's such a big deal, we first have to understand what the status quo was like before this tool existed. Okay, let's take a look. If you were in, let's say, the shoes of a bug bountier and you found this key, like, what would be your next step?
I would probably just straight up report it. I don't think I'd even bother testing it. I'd just be like, it starts with private key, it's public, this must be bad.
I would report it. I don't expect to get paid for it, but it's really weird, right? Because you don't know where it's gonna go. You don't know if it's valid. And then also, like, if you go in, like, I don't know, if you go and put this into a server and you log into it and it gives you access, like, did you push it too much? Like, did you go through something that you're not supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, so we don't even know if this thing is SSH or not. It could be.
Right.
It could be used for SSL. It could be used for Bitcoin. Like, we have no idea. It's just some encryption key.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably Google part of it or all of it, see if it pops up anywhere else. But that I don't think you'd be able to.
Google the private key.
Maybe. Although I don't think you'd find. I don't think that'd drop up in anything.
I would try to find out what this goes to, because it could go to a few things. A lot of times, like, SSH is a big one. I feel like it would be interesting to see if I can dump a list of everything that has, like, port 22 open or anything that fingerprint SSH. You go to a showdown, for example, and put Twitter for the org and then, like, port 22. That would be an easy one to do. But also, it's weird because if I feel like a lot of times it's like internal stuff that you can't even access anyways.
I guess you'd have to know the context to do it, right? You'd have to figure out whether that's like encrypting something fairly dangerous. I mean, I'm seeing SSL.
Okay, so here is the problem statement. What if you're doing a code review and you find an asymmetric encryption private key? How do you know if that private key is an issue or not? Before we can answer that question, we need to ask ourselves what asymmetric encryption private keys are used for. Asymmetric encryption keys are broken up into two main parts, public keys and private keys. Public keys provide you with the information that you need to encrypt a message such that only the private key that corresponds with that public key can decrypt the message. Public keys can't be rotated and are permanently attached to the private keys that they're generated with. In fact, the two components are actually useless if you don't have both. That's why when you find something that says private key in this PEM format, it actually contains both the public key and the private key inside of it. Public keys themselves can't do any encrypt or decrypt operations, which is why they're often shared or distributed widely just to provide folks instructions on how to encrypt to the private key that corresponds with that given public key. So what we did was we collected as many different public keys as we possibly could that we knew paired with sensitive private keys. And then we indexed them all in a database so that when someone finds a public-private key pairing, we can extract the public key out of that that and look it up in the database to see if that private key is sensitive. Two major use cases of public-private key pairings are SSH and TLS. We ended up collecting billions of public keys that correspond to those two different use cases, and you might be wondering where we collected all of those public keys from. To understand that, let's first tackle TLS. TLS is the bedrock for which all of our web browsing traffic encryption is built on top of.
I think people don't realize as well, it's such a kind of integral part that we don't really think about anymore. We're just like, oh yes, Google Chrome has a little tick, which means my data is safe, without necessarily understanding what makes that data safe.
TLS works because authorities we trust go out and verify that entities own domains they say they own. Then these authorities take the public key that belongs to those entities as well as the domain and package them together into a document. That document is called a certificate, and as long as a browser is presented with a certificate that's signed by one of these trusted authorities, also known as certificate authorities, we know that the private key that corresponds with the signed public key can safely encrypt and decrypt messages to the given domain, because it's been validated that the private key owner owns the domain. So how many trusted root certificate authorities are there? Well, interestingly, we're actually not all on the same page about that. See, Firefox trusts about 147 different trusted root authorities. macOS trusts about 168 different root authorities, and Windows trusts 255 different root authorities. It's also a bit more complicated than that because these root authorities can actually delegate their signing abilities to an intermediate or a reseller. Look, there's a lot. That's the long story short, and we're supposed to give nearly every single one of them nearly unlimited power to validate who owns which domains. As you might have guessed, with such a big list, it turns out some of them weren't exactly good at their jobs. In 2015, Google found an authority that signed a key that didn't belong to Google, but it had google.com in the certificate. That meant that the real owner of that key could encrypt and decrypt traffic on behalf of Google. Symantec was the trusted authority that issued the certificate. At this time in 2015, it was very difficult to know if hackers had keys that could encrypt for your domain or not. If a hacker managed to get their public key signed with a domain they didn't own from one of these certificate authorities, they could stay undetected. They could impersonate the domain owner to their heart's content. They relied on a decentralized signature-based system. When Google found evidence that this was actually occurring, they forced Symantec to perform a full audit to try to find other instances where people managed to get certificates signed for domains they didn't own. Symantec found over 2,000 instances of certificates that had been created for entities that didn't own the domains that were listed in the certificates. That's kind of crazy when you think about it, that these certificate authorities that we trusted with unlimited power to verify who owns which domains, given unlimited slack and no auditability, turned out to be really bad at their jobs. The action Google took next was a little bit radical, and the impacts are still with us today. Are you familiar with certificate transparency?
Not exactly.
I think it just logs every certificate that I've ever found, right? It's just you query for it for every single cert that I've gone and they put in a database. It's decoded and you can just search through it based on like the common name, the organization, location, email, all the registration of it, and then what it goes to.
Do you know why certificate transparency exists?
I don't know. I looked into it. I can't remember what it was for.
Yeah, so certificate transparency, my understanding is that it's a new kind of process involved in keeping a log of generated certificates and attributes of those certificates in an open way, primarily to counter if certificate authorities, my understanding is it was incepted because certificate authorities were getting compromised and it wasn't clear when those bad events were happening. And so the intent was to get some visibility in the community around, hey, something bad has happened to the root certificate at Symantec or whoever.
Over the next 3 years, Google made it a requirement that every new certificate minted had to be publicly logged in a ledger called certificate transparency that would be auditable for everyone to see. The way they enforced this is after 2018, any certificate that was minted that wasn't logged in certificate transparency would not be trusted by Google Chrome. It's kind of nuts when you think about it. The solution to prevent certificate authorities from creating bad certificates wasn't to prevent them from doing doing so at all. It was just to provide visibility into when it happens. Now remember, certificates contain both a public key and a domain. This means for the purposes of TLS, internal, external, it doesn't matter, every single public key and domain ended up getting logged in the public ledger called certificate transparency. And this is true to this day. You might see where this is going. We downloaded every single TLS certificate in certificate transparency. We extracted all of the public keys from those certificates and we indexed them in a database. What this then enables us to do is if we ever find a private key, we can instantly look it up and see whether or not that key can be used to encrypt or decrypt something sensitive with TLS. Here's what this looks like in action. Here is a private key that was committed to a GitHub repository. If we use Driftwood, we can see that multiple certificates are returned from the given private key that we look up. Here's an interesting fact. While certificates expire, private keys do not expire. The surrounding context for this given key would have given us one certificate, not the additional 5 certificates that were attached to this key. Okay, now that we know how it works, let's take it to the next level. What we did was we took about 50,000 private keys that we were able to find that were leaked out, and we used Driftwood to look them all up. When we took all the keys and we looked them up against the API I just showed, we get back, like hundreds of impacted certificates. And so these are all like, we don't even know, like in 100% of the cases, we did not know any of the context of the surrounding code. We didn't even care. Like the only thing that we did was we just programmatically pulled all these in and we looked them against this API and we said, are any of these impacting certificates? And then beyond that, have any of them not expired yet? And then we can also look at the domains to see which domains may be impacted. Like we can see a bunch of 2021 results. Like, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but like these are like fairly recent. And then a few of them haven't expired yet, and we're working through disclosure now. So what is it? Okay, so it's October 26th today. So this one technically is expired as of 6 days ago. We were able to find hundreds of affected certificates from this sample, and the ones that were still active, we disclosed and got them revoked. Just to reiterate how crazy this is, we went from having 50,000 private keys and having no ability to tell whether or not they were sensitive to instantly getting a list of all of the keys that could be used to encrypt TLS. We didn't stop there though, because like I mentioned, these keys can be used for more than just TLS. They can also be used for SSH. But because these keys are so multi-purpose, like you don't know if this key is being used somewhere else, if it's this developer is just using the same key all over the place. And I feel like it just kind of leaves you with this nebulous feeling of uncertainty where you might submit the key and then
be told it's test. But then you don't know what it's being used for.
Right, or maybe it's used for more than one thing. Secure Shell, or SSH, is a way to run shell commands on a remote server. SSH supports a number of different authorization and authentication methods. One of the most popular and secure methods is through asymmetric encryption. The way it works is you can generate a public-private key pairing and then load your public key onto a file on the remote server. When you try to authenticate to the server, you present your public key, and if that matches one of the keys in the authorized keys file on the remote server can encrypt a message that only your private key can decrypt. If you successfully decrypt the message, you've essentially proven that you own the private key for the given public key that you presented. This tells the remote server that you are who you say you are, which enables it to set up an encrypted tunnel and run commands through that tunnel. What's your GitHub username?
Just Nahamsek. You're probably not going to find a lot of mine because there's literally nothing on GitHub that I've posted, to be honest.
Did you know that your SSH keys are publicly available and easy to query?
I did not know that, no.
Yeah, every time you do a git clone and you use your key for that, GitHub just, for all the keys you have added to your account, make those publicly available.
Interesting.
And
so they can enumerate people's key that way too, to some extent.
That's exactly right. These are all the public keys. And now you have something really powerful because these keys aren't just used to SSH into like laptops and servers and stuff. You know for certain that these keys can be used to impersonate you on
For
GitHub.
GitHub itself, that would be scary, yeah.
This is such an effective method to authenticate someone. People realize that you can use this technology just to prove a person's identity and set up an encrypted tunnel. We don't actually need to allow them to run arbitrary commands on the server. Git supports this method of authentication. So in platforms like GitHub, we can upload our public keys and use SSH to prove that we are who we say we are, and then GitHub will allow us to push and pull Git diffs without actually allowing us to run arbitrary code on the GitHub server. What's interesting is this method of authentication actually gives us pretty full access to a person's GitHub account. There's no way to scope these keys down like you can with personal access tokens. You either have full access to push and pull to all of the repositories that user can, or you have no access.
Yeah, you can obviously query against GitHub's API to determine if that private key is linked to anyone's GitHub account as their
account. Let me just ask, do you use this SSH key for anything outside of?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably pretty common that people will use the same key to SSH to maybe EC2 instances, or I mean any other kind of SSH access. It's pretty common. Not many people will have a whole bunch of separate keys. Yeah, that's not great.
Why is it not great?
Well, because, I mean, so for one, if you had the private key for my GitHub pub key, you'd be able to push commits as me. So you'd be able to impersonate me on GitHub. The same problem exists on Bitbucket and GitLab, I would presume. So any kind of Git-based system which is going over SSH will have that problem. I imagine like trying to figure out how to use those private keys to access instances like over SSH outside of kind of source code management systems would be a little bit more complicated to determine, but that would also be a risk as well.
Okay, so here's how this usually works in the real world. A given developer's laptop will usually only have one primary SSH key. That developer will use that key for GitHub, but they'll also use it for all the other servers that they need to run code on. If we can find a private key and prove that it matches with a given user's GitHub account, it's very likely the same key can be used to SSH into other servers that developer has access to. Given this key, not just can it go to any SSL certificate, but also can it authenticate to anyone's GitHub account. And that's also probably a pretty strong indicator of whether or not it can SSH into additional services, because people use SSH keys for multiple things all the time, basically.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
And what I think we're gonna see, I think we'll find user accounts that are impacted that have push rights to really important projects.
Yeah,
And
for
so
sure.
We saw.
Oh, and then you have supply chain vulns as well, where
Exactly.
you introduce a vulnerability in supply chain. Oh my God, I love that. That's amazing.
And so, like, you know, what was it, like a week ago or something like that? The user agent parser got compromised. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that was NPM, right?
It was an NPM package, and all it does is, given a user agent, tells you what browser it goes to. You know, it might give you what operating system and things like that, but it's a very like narrow scope. But because it's used so widely by so many different companies, it's just code execution at every big tech company you can think of. And then if you read the write-up on, I think, the journalist that broke the story, it says a core contributor's account got compromised, and it's unclear how it was compromised. We took the same 50,000 keys from before and checked them against GitHub accounts, and found dozens of affected accounts. Because these keys give us almost full access to each impacted account, we just needed to check that user's public activity stream to get an idea for which repositories they can push to. We found that these accounts had access to hundreds of different projects. Some of these projects were huge and maintained by some of the largest companies in the world, including IBM, ARM, and Oracle. Of all of the hundreds of projects that these keys could push to, we then tried to get a sense of how many downstream endpoints or devices were using the code from each of the affected projects. To the best of our estimate, because some of these projects were so large, there likely would have been millions of affected devices if someone had used these keys to push malicious code to all of the repositories that they had access to. Here's an example of Driftwood working in action to find an SSH key. From From this given private key, we can immediately see if it affects any GitHub users, and in this case, it does. We did a ton of responsible disclosures and got as many of these keys revoked and rotated as we possibly could. I know about Express a little bit better than I know about React, just because I've worked more with Express. It's basically like the #1 Node.js web framework out there. So if you're using Node.js and you're developing web app, you're using Express. But if you look at the dependencies for Express and the dependencies of the dependencies and the dependencies of the dependencies of the dependencies, you get so far down the rabbit hole, well, you'll end up with single projects with a single maintainer on the other side of the world that, you know, doesn't know what they're doing, doesn't know security or something like that. And that code gets, not only does that code potentially get ran as a part of Express, but when you install a dependency, that dependency has the opportunity to run something called a post install hook. And what that basically is as soon as the dependency gets installed, the dependency has the opportunity to run arbitrary code on your system. So it doesn't even need to be ran. If you just do npm install dependency, that dependency can execute code on that install without you needing to do anything with the library itself once it gets installed. So what you end up with is a huge, massive list of dependencies that ultimately funnel up to this huge web app framework that the entire world uses. If any of those downstream ones, you get to compromise one of those developers. And what's really neat about this is you don't need to test anything. You know, you can just look the key up, and as long as the key matches, you never have to log into anything. There's no worrying about going out of scope or anything like that. You know for certain that you can take down the big project and anybody who installs any piece of that dependency train. Here's one more consideration. About 2,500 of the 50,000 keys that we sampled were actually encrypted with a symmetric encryption key. This means the key owner picked a passphrase to encrypt the key, and the key can't be used until we know what the passphrase is. Almost instantly, we were able to guess about 70% of the passphrases used in these 2,500 keys. Because of this, we built a basic word list into Driftwood so it can guess some of the most common passphrases when it finds an encrypted key. Here's a demonstration of that in action.
Yeah, that's exciting, dude. I gotta see some of the results of some of these big companies.
I really hope someone does some awesome stuff with this. Like, I'd love to see this built on, and like, this already, this looks amazing, but like, to see what the community could do with it, that is going to be really, I can't wait. That's going to be really exciting.
Oh God. Have you found?
So why is it your reaction is to cringe or to think that this is a bad technology when I'm showing you this stuff?
I just think it's one of those, it's that weird cycle of pain when, you know, security, because I really advocate for access to security tooling. I know it gets really, really confusing because a lot of security tooling and software can be used for nefarious reasons and also for good reasons. I used to go through these discussions with Wade on the Beef project all the time because, you know, it was quite an offensive facing tool. It's just this, it's this cycle.
A light way of putting a malware framework, right?
Right. Exactly. But it is that weird thing where it's kind of like, well, look, these capabilities do exist out there, and the idea is to give the defenders, or try and where you can balance some of the asymmetry, right? Give the defenders some tooling to help them understand how, you know, people. And not even that I would understand what these threat actors are looking like, but certainly, you know, they specialize in, I mean, you know, you can make all sorts of assumptions about, you know, how highly skilled attackers are able to do all these things, and you never hear about them, right? So whether or not what you're going through could be in the toolkit for people with nefarious reasons, and they have no intent of ever sharing how they've done what you're looking to make available to defenders, you know? So that's what I mean. I would always, maybe what you're talking about is entirely novel in the entire world, which is awesome, but what's to stop anyone else from doing similar? And so in that vein, we should be trying to provide defenders with tools to try and be proactive with their defense. But the thing is, when you first do it, there's like this little bit of pain, right? There's this little hump. And so my response initially is like, no, I can see how this would be bad. But obviously, like once you get over that hump, it then goes up because it's like, cool, this is bad, but hey, people, here's how you can defend against these things, you know? And you think about like when Truffle Hog first came out, there's that first little cringe hump, right? Where it's like, oh, this is really, really bad. But then if you look at the way that Truffle Hog is used today, it's almost ubiquitous. Like you can't go to any product vendor that does like DevSecOps style tooling, and every single one of those toolkits will have a secrets detection capability. And it's just kind of standard practice. So you're basically just introducing something that is like, this is novel, this is scary, this is new. But then what you basically are now preparing for is in the future, this will just become ubiquitous. It's like, this is how you can actually turn information that maybe you didn't have visibility or you couldn't diagnose the risk appropriately, but you move towards that point where organizations can actually kind of triage these issues themselves in more automated and efficient ways, which is kind of the heart of DevSecOps style stuff, right?
And even just looking at Twitter's open source, you can see just a long list of private keys that are impossible to dig through and sort through. This is definitely a problem that everyone just ignores.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe now it's time to stop ignoring when these keys pop up.
Okay, so just to summarize, we started with thousands of private keys and no way to know which ones were sensitive or not. We now have an instant way to extract a public key out of a given private key and look it up in a database that contains billions of public keys, each of which we know correspond to a sensitive private key. This gives us the ability to immediately know if a private key is sensitive. The last thing I'll note here is that we plan to natively integrate this capability into Truffle Hog. So when Truffle Hog finds a private key, it will instantly tell you whether or not that private key is sensitive. We didn't get a chance to get that done before we open sourced Driftwood, but look forward to that in the future. Okay, thank you so much for watching, and subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos like this in the future. By the way, are you a Golang developer and do you want to work on cool open source security tools? We're hiring. Check out our careers page for more information.